Let me say a little bit about the speaker. Professor Phiroze Vasunia is head of the Department of Greek and Latin at University College London. This is his current position. He has written on a range of texts and periods from antiquity to the modern era and has research interests in the study of cross-cultural contact and something that we are so fond of talking about in India, colonialism. He is the author of The Gift of the Nile, published in 2001, and The Classics in Colonial India in 2013, and the co-author of Post-Classicism in 2019. He is the editor of several books, including a volume just published in April 2025 on classics and race, and historical reader, it's published along with his colleagues, Sarah Debu and Daniel Orels. He is also the general editor of the book series Ancients and Moderns, published by Bloomsbury. When I got the topic, I was thoroughly confused. I just didn't know what we were going to hear, and also very intrigued. Because the other in the title of this lecture is, of course, a provocation. Sappho did not compose her poems in Sanskrit to begin with. She composed in Greek and lived in the 7th and 6th centuries BCE. Her compositions include poems of exquisite beauty and touch on themes such as love, longing, the body, the senses, and sexual jealousy. And in that respect, she calls out for comparison with early Sanskrit poets, who also wrote poems of surprising and surpassing beauty on love. The lecture explores compositions by Sappho and lyric poems by women in South Asia and compares the verses of these diverse ancient traditions. Of course, he will be quoting to us from English translations, though, Professor Vasunia, there's a great surge of people learning Sanskrit today in our part of the world.
Thank you very much for that warm and generous introduction, Dr. Phiroze Godrej. It's not very often that a Phiroze gets to be introduced by a Phiroze. So it's an even greater honor to be here for that reason. But thank you really to Dr. Godrej for her patience, for putting up with all the changes in communications from my side, and for doing this without any complaint. I've been an admirer of hers as a scholar and an intellectual for many years. So I am more flattered than I can say to be here speaking to you at the museum. And of course, the museum itself is a venue that I've known since my youth in Mumbai, and I've not spoken at this institution before. My thanks to the Museum Society for the invitation. The lecture is partly inspired by the ancient sculptures exhibition that was just mentioned a little while ago. And I remember I was here last year in January of 2024, and I came to have a look at the exhibition at the time, and I was shown around by a very knowledgeable volunteer. And he asked me what I did, and I said I was a professor of Greek and Latin in London. And I'm not sure that he actually believed me when I said that. But he was very knowledgeable, and I learned a lot from him. And it's great to hear also about the future projects that the museum is going to be putting on in this vein. So today we're going to look comparatively at Sappho and a few women poets who are composing in Sanskrit. And as you heard already, the title is a kind of provocation, and the word "other" is the provocation in the title, if you will. It's clearly not the case that Sappho composed in Sanskrit, but there are so many resonances between the two cultural traditions and the traditions of erotic poetry and love poetry that they almost seem to be screaming out for a kind of comparison. So I'm going to attempt a brief, if you will, exercise in comparatism this afternoon. I hope you can hear me at the back. If there's any problem, please wave or get my attention for any reason. I can't really see you very clearly, so you'll have to really wave very vigorously if you want to get my attention. So Sappho, as we heard, lived in the 7th and 6th centuries BC, and she was born, or rather she flourished and composed her poetry on the island of Lesbos, which is marked here for us on the map. It's close to the coast of modern-day Turkey, so it's closer to modern-day Turkey than the Greek mainland. But that's not entirely surprising from the perspective of the ancient Greek world, because there were many Greeks and Greek speakers who had settled on the coast of West Asia and in the region of modern-day Turkey. So she flourished on that island, and she composed her poems in a special dialect of Greek. We think of it as a dialect called Aeolic. And of course, her fame has echoed through the centuries, as Byron here reminds us in this excerpt from Don Juan. The isles of Greece, where burning Sappho loved and sung, where grew the arts of war and peace, where Delos rose and Phoebus sprung. Eternal summer gilds them yet, but all except their sun is set. Byron associates ancient Greece with Sappho, as we can see here, and he thinks of Sappho when he's evoking the lost glory of Greece. And this is high praise indeed from Byron. He was not a very modest poet, as I'm sure you know. And Don Juan is filled with all these echoes of Greece and of these Hellenic allusions. It's well worth reading that long and epic poem if you haven't already encountered it. The reception of Sappho is very important for literature in Europe, and she had many imitators and rivals. In the Renaissance, in England alone, there were some 100 compositions that were composed in the meter that Sappho uses, which after her came to be called Sapphic. So the particular metrical form that she uses came to be known as Sapphics. She is the one who makes them famous. But the reception of Sappho is also very important for the reception of Sanskrit erotic poetry in the 18th and 19th centuries in Europe. And that is because a lot of the commentators and critics who were coming to Sanskrit erotic poetry were doing so through the lens of Sappho. So many of them wrote their commentaries in Latin. Some of them wrote them in modern European languages, and they explicitly make connections between the Sanskrit erotic traditions and the love poetic traditions of Greece, and especially that of Sappho. So they're seeing, these European critics are seeing things, they're seeing this poetry through a Sapphic lens, if you will. And Dr. Maddalena Italia has completed her thesis at SOAS a few years ago on this very topic, and her book is forthcoming, and I was privileged to be allowed to read it in advance. The fame of Sappho is such that she is already a classic in ancient Greece. So already by the 5th century BC, Sappho is famous in Greece itself. So within 100 years of her time, she is already a very highly regarded poet. And she appears on vases such as this one, which is an Athenian red figure vase from about 480 BC, and she's also mentioned by authors such as Herodotus, who incidentally is also born on the coast of what used to be called Asia Minor. So Sappho is shown in a variety of illustrations and, as I say, mentioned by many authors. Here, on this vase, she's the figure on the right, and the bearded person on the left is the poet Alcaeus, who is often lumped together, placed together with Sappho in the Greek poetic traditions. And you can see there Alcaeus is holding a lyre in his hand, and that is because the poems that Sappho and Alcaeus composed were not read by readers privately in their bedroom somewhere, but they were sung, they were performed, they were often performed to music. So these were live experiences, if you will. They were not words that one generally encountered on a page. So as one of my teachers said, Greek is a noise, it's not black dots on a page. So noise is perhaps not the best word to use. Anyway, you could say Greek is a music, and then perhaps that might capture what Sappho is doing a little more accurately. So as we can see, she's already being depicted on vases in the 5th century BC, and on this vase, I believe she's actually identified by name. There are other vases where she's not identified by name, but we surmise that the person who's being represented on the vase is Sappho. She was known for her skill in composition in Aeolic Greek, as I mentioned, and Aeolic Greek was not the language of Athens in the 5th century BC when this vase was created, but it was the language of the area where Sappho grew up, and it has many Homeric resonances, many Homeric traces. Homer's own language, the language of the Iliad and the Odyssey, is also very different from the language of the everyday person, we might say, in Athens in the 5th century BC. So Homer's dialect is a very stylized kind of dialect. Sappho's Greek is very stylized in turn, as is the Sanskrit of the Sanskrit poets in their own way. And this particular Greek is, as I said, associated with verse. The Greek that most people today learn when they learn ancient Greek is the Greek of the 5th century BC of Athens, or they might learn the Greek of the New Testament, which is a slightly simplified form of the Attic Greek of the 5th century BC. So Sappho is composing in a slightly different language than the language, shall we say, of the famous playwrights such as Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, or the philosopher Plato, or the comedian Aristophanes, or the orators Demosthenes, and so forth. This is a slightly earlier stage in the history of the language. This vase shows us Sappho reading. We think it's Sappho. We're not entirely sure. This vase is also from the 5th century BC. Because Sappho is so famous and because she's so accomplished, when people see pictures of women writing on vases, they often say, oh, that's Sappho. So it's not necessarily the case that this is guaranteed to be Sappho, but it's a plausible guess that this is Sappho. And it resembles a vase that I think, if I'm not mistaken, is at the National Museum in Athens. So this central image of the woman reading the tablet there, or a scroll, is one that we find on this other vase as well. Many of the poems of Sappho are difficult to read and interpret. And her poetry survives because often it's quoted by later authors, such as Longinus, who is composing in the 1st, 2nd century AD, or it survives because it survives on papyri that have been recovered from desert locations in northern Egypt, especially from the region of Oxyrhynchus in the Nile Delta. And there are thousands and thousands of these papyri that have been excavated and that have survived and that have been edited, and Sappho's poetry happens to be on these papyri. But the papyri are often very fragmentary. They're, as I say, difficult to read. They're sometimes very brief. So there's one papyrus, for example, that just has one word on it, Artemis, referring to the goddess Artemis. And that's all that we have of this poem, which is referred to as fragment 84. Until 2004, only 63 of her 264 surviving poems contained any complete lines, and only 21 any complete stanzas, and only 3 had been complete enough to appreciate as literary structures according to this scholarly judgment. It's true that Sappho has not been preserved independently in the manuscript traditions in the way that, say, Homer is preserved, or Virgil is preserved, or Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides are preserved. She survives not because there are entire manuscripts of her work, but because other authors quote her, or papyri and scraps and fragments here and there have been found in places like Oxyrhynchus in Egypt. So one reason why people didn't copy out her manuscripts and pass them down is because, probably, to put it frankly, they couldn't handle the fact that here was a woman talking about love, and often she was talking about love of other women. So her poetry is not only about the love of other women, it's about conjugal love, it's about love between men and women as well. But she does talk about love between women, and the Christian monks who are copying these manuscripts probably found that too hot to handle. So they chose to omit her poems in that tradition. In the 19th, 20th centuries, there were also Bowdlerized versions of Sappho, and some authors suggested that she was a kind of school teacher, she was a school mistress, and she ran a kind of girls' school, and she was talking to her students about nature and sort of birds and so forth. And that is the idea that Sappho is this kind of pure, innocent school teacher is a complete misconception of who Sappho was. And I think scholars now have moved beyond that view that Sappho was a kind of school teacher, school mistress in that vein. So we think we've sort of advanced a bit in our grasp of Sappho. As I said, the poems were sung often to the accompaniment of music. Perhaps they were performed by a solo singer, or perhaps they were performed by a choral group. So it could be either scenario, but taking into account this context is very important to our understanding of Sappho. We need to think of this poetry as performed, as sung, as recited, as accompanied by music, performed to an audience, and not read without all this apparatus. So there were certain contexts in which this kind of poetry was recited, just as we'll see, there's certain contexts in which Sanskrit poetry too needs to be appreciated and located. As I said also, Sappho mentions love between girls or women, and she becomes famous for that. The word lesbian comes from the island of Lesbos, where Sappho was from. In antiquity, it didn't have the connotation that it does today. It simply meant a person from the island of Lesbos. Today, of course, that word has a very different kind of resonance. Sappho also composes hymns, wedding songs, laments, and she, in her poetry, privileges the woman's voice, women's experience. The I voice, the I of lyric poetry, is emphasized by her. She's one of the first poets in the Greek tradition to compose poetry with that prominent lyric first-person voice. Let's start with a very short poem by Sappho, and this is a very short, but it's a translation by Anne Carson, who is herself a very distinguished poet and has translated all of Sappho's poems. Eros shook my mind like a mountain wind falling on oak trees. The word eros is the Greek word for love. It often means sexual love, sexual passion. If we're talking about a different kind of love, the love that families have, the love that relatives have for each other within a family structure, we would use the word philia in Greek, but this is eros. Eros is often the word used for sexual love. There's an ancient philosopher who says that eros is the word for love, and eros doubled is madness. In this, even in this short poem, you can see some of the themes that we associate with Sappho's poetry. The emphasis on the body, or the mind, if you will, the senses. Eros is shaking the narrator, the narrative voice. The world of nature has already come into the picture here. The wind, the mountain, the oak trees. And these are recurring themes in the poetry of Sappho and also in the Sanskrit erotic poetry. Let's move on from this very short poem to a slightly longer poem, and this is fragment 16 by Sappho. I just wanted to show you the Greek just very briefly, only so that you might have a glimpse of the shape of the stanza that Sappho uses when she's composing a poetry. So you can see the 3 long lines followed by a short line, and each of the stanzas is in that form. And that's the meter of Sappho that comes to be known as Sapphic. Greek meter, like Sanskrit meter, is based on quantity. So unlike English, which is based on stress, Greek meter is based on long and short syllables. So in English, for example, with Shakespeare, you might have to be or not to be. That is the question, which is an example of iambic, or to give you another example from Shakespeare, Macbeth, 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 beware Macduff. That again is an instance of iambic pentameter, where the stress falls on the second syllable in each of the feet. But in Greek, the way in which meter works is very different. The meter is determined by the sequence of long and short vowels. So it's a bit like music, where you have long notes, and Western classical music, where you have long notes and short notes. So it's partly based on that schema. Here's a translation of this poem. Some say an army of horsemen, others say foot soldiers, still others a fleet of ships is the fairest thing on the dark earth. I say it is whatever one loves. Everyone can understand this. Consider that Helen, far surpassing the beauty of mortals, leaving behind the best man of all, sailed away to Troy. She had no memory of her child or dear parents, since she was led astray by Cypris, by Aphrodite, lightly reminding me now of Anactoria being gone. I would rather see her lovely step and the radiant sparkle of her face than all the war chariots in Lydia and soldiers battling in shining bronze. So this is one of the fuller poems that we have by Sappho. And you can already see in that first stanza here that there's a contrast being implied between what some people say. Some say an army, others infantry, others the fleet of ships is the most beautiful thing. But I say it's whatever one loves. Sappho is there undoubtedly distancing herself from Homer and the Iliadic tradition, the tradition that celebrates all those very things, the horsemen, the infantry, the fleet of ships. And she's contrasting her own poetry, her own priorities, if you will, to the priorities of Homer. So it's a distancing from the Greek epic tradition, from the Homeric tradition. She also mentions Helen, and she emphasizes Helen, if you will, more than she seems to emphasize the warriors and the soldiers and the horsemen and so forth. She understands, she seems to understand, she seems to sympathize the reasons that drove Helen to abandon her husband and to take off with Paris and go to Troy. There's, if you will, a link in this poem between the mythological past and the present of Anactoria. So perhaps it's Helen. The poem is very fragmentary here on this point. Anactoria is Helen is reminding Sappho of this person called Anactoria who is away. So we might speculate that the narrator is missing Anactoria, and she would rather be reunited with Anactoria, see her step, see the sparkle of her face, than the war chariots and the soldiers and so on and so forth. So Sappho is giving her own answer here to the question, what is the most beautiful thing on the dark earth? She kind of gives, if you will, a generalizing answer. It's the thing that you love. That's the most beautiful thing on the earth. But also a very distinctive personal reading, if you will, of the poem, in which she's saying, I say it's what I love. In this case, it might well be Anactoria. She is the one that I love. The Greek scholar, the scholar of Greek, Jack Winkler, also made the observation a while ago about this poem, that the poem seems to be saying it's not just women who desire or who are subject to desire, but it's also men. All valuation is an act of desire, is what Winkler suggested. And men also have desires, erotic desires, in this poem, but their desires are for victory, for a particular kind of masculinity, if you will, for a particular kind of prowess. So it's not that women are desiring creatures, men are not. That's not what Sappho is suggesting here. She's suggesting something quite different, that we're all subject to desire. Let's move on to one last example from Sappho. And this is fragment 31 in the conventional numbering. To me it seems that man has the fortune of gods, whoever sits beside you and close, who listens to you sweetly speaking and laughing temptingly. My heart flutters in my breast whenever I look quickly for a moment. I say nothing, my tongue broken, a delicate fire runs under my skin, my eyes see nothing, my ears roar, cold sweat rushes down me, trembling seizes me, I am greener than grass. To myself I seem needing but little to die, but all must be endured since. And then the poem breaks off, unfortunately. The poem is preserved for us because the critic Longinus, who's writing in the Roman Empire in Greek, quotes this poem for us. And he praises it as an example of the lofty or the sublime in Greek. So Longinus thought that there was a degree of sublimity about this poem. Elevation or sublimity is a very particular characteristic of Greek literature. It doesn't quite correspond to the English word sublime, but that's the conventional translation that we give to that concept of hupsos, or elevation, in Greek. It seems the narrator seems to be addressing another woman. That woman is sitting next to a man, and the narrator is saying that she's jealous of the man who's sitting next to the woman that the narrator is looking at. Right? She's jealous of the guy because he's sitting next to the woman whom the narrator finds attractive. So it's addressed to the woman who is face to face with the eye. Possibly that woman's getting married to the man sitting next to her. So in that case, it's addressed to a bride, and we say that because a lot of Sappho's poems are addressed to brides. Perhaps the man is not even present. It's the conceit of the poem. It's a rhetorical device. We can't quite be sure, but within the world of the poem, there seems to be someone else sitting there next to that woman. Again, we see in this poem the emphasis on the bodily and the bodily response that couldn't be more pronounced in this poem. With the heart in my breast, my tongue is broken, the fire runs under my skin, my eyes see nothing, my ears raw cold sweat. Her entire body is in a state of commotion and turmoil because of what she's feeling and experiencing here. So perhaps this is an example of sexual jealousy. The narrator is jealous that the man is sitting next to her beloved. One might think of this in other terms as an example of triangular love, in the sense that the narrator, you might say, loves the woman because she's loved by someone else. So in that sense, the relationship is triangular. So the fact that the woman is loved by someone else makes the narrator's love the more intense for that woman. And there are these theories of mimetic desire that one could invoke to understand the relationships within this poem. This poem was already very highly regarded in antiquity, and it was copied and translated into Latin by the poet Catullus in the 1st century BC. Let's move on to the women poets who are composing in Sanskrit. I thought I would keep my remarks to Sanskrit love poems that are composed by women, or we think are composed by women. We can't be absolutely sure that they are composed by women. In the smaller kavya tradition, from which extends pretty widely from the 2nd to the 3rd centuries, it's difficult to reconstruct the contexts of the composition of these poems. It's been suggested that the poems are composed in aristocratic circles, in court contexts. In medieval India, it's suggested perhaps that courtesans, as we euphemistically use the word, composed these poems. So those are possibilities. They're not. We can't rule them out. They might well be true. By one estimate, there's 140 poems in one play that are composed by women writing in Sanskrit. And many of these poems survive for us, as I'm sure you know, in anthologies that were composed by later writers. So their traditions are complicated because they're assembled, they're put together by different anthologists, and there are numerous such anthologists of love poetry. The verse is often very finely crafted. Often the Sanskrit lyric verses are 4 lines long, and they have their own particular metrical structure. And again, it's important to bear in mind things like rasa and dhvani when we're appreciating these poems. I'm sure I scarcely need to say this to you, but evoking Shringara rasa, the rasa of love, is important in these poems, and that's evoked often through suggestion, through sounding the right note, through dhvani. And often the love poems that we read It's hard to say whether they're composed by men or women, and here is an example of a poem, for example, of a poem that is composed by that well-known author, Anonymous. And it reads, "Though I knit my brow, my gaze is fixed longingly anyway. Though I check my tongue, this tortured face of mine dissolves in a smile. Though I drive my ear to hardness, my body bears the goose flesh of desire. When I see that man, how on earth can my anger survive?" And I don't know, you would, I think, be hard-pressed to say whether this was composed by a man or a woman. We see here, again, the emphasis on the body and the senses' desire is being worked through the bodily, and the force of sexual passion, too, is quite transparent. This next poem is attributed to Vidya and is translated here in Daniel Ingle's vast edition of the Vidyakara. "You are fortunate, dear friends, that you can tell what happened with your lovers, the jests and laughter, all the words and joys. After my sweetheart put his hand to the knot of my dress, I swear that I remember nothing." The ostensible point of this poem is forgetting, if you will. It's a kind of amnesia. But the poet observes all the strictures of decorum and propriety and sort of resorts to silence, if you will, at that delicate moment when the knot of the dress is untied. The knot of the dress being untied is a regular theme that we find in these poems. But the tone of the poem is consistent and consistent with other poems. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Sanskrit love lyric poet is very rarely explicit. It often works through suggestion, and that is arguably true of Sappho, and it's true of some other Greek poets, but it's not always true of Greek poetry. Vidya's poem is preserved for us, as I said, in the vast anthology, the Vidyakara. And let's perhaps turn to another poem by the same author. "You were first conquered by that God who bears the mark of the moon, and after by the Buddha with elevated perception, and then by my love, the wayfarer. Alas, having abandoned them, you harmed me, that exceedingly frail girl, a woman without a protector. Damn you, damn your masculinity, damn your raising, damn your bow, and damn your arrows." So the poem has a voice, the I voice again, in which the narrator seems to be addressing karma or desire, and she's saying that Shiva was able to overcome him. The Buddha was able to overcome him. My beloved, the wayfarer, was also able to overcome desire. But I, this exceedingly frail girl, a woman without a protector, am unable to resist desire, and so therefore the curses follow. Damn you, damn your masculinity, etc. The poem is structured perhaps in two halves, and the first part refers to Shiva, Buddha, and the lover who can overcome karma. You probably know the story. It's in the Puranas and elsewhere about how Shiva destroys Kamadeva, the third eye opens and there's a blaze of fire and it destroys him. Buddha resists Mara, and while they can resist Kamadeva, while they can resist the god of desire, the god of love, the woman narrator is unable to do so. And so she utters these curses as a response. So perhaps the two halves can also be understood as the male half versus the female half, if you will. And there's a complicated way in which we're invited to sympathize, I think, with the narrator, but then we might ask ourselves, why is it that she is unable to resist Kamadeva when the others have been able to resist the god of desire? And is it that she's somehow too frail, too weak, or is there something else going on? Let's move on. And there's a very good analysis of this poem by the person who's translated it as well, Catherine Geddes. Here's a poem by Sheila Bhattarika. Why such breathing from running fast? The bristling cheek from joy at having won him over. Your braid is loose from falling at his feet, and why so wan from so much talking? Your face is wet with sweat because the sun is hot. The knot has fallen loose upon your dress from coming and from going. Oh, messenger, what will you say about your lip, the color of a faded lotus? So the form of this poem is slightly different in the sense that it's a kind of question and answer. It's a dialogue between someone posing the questions to the woman, and she's giving these answers. And once again, her desire is expressed through all these bodily gestures, through her hair, the cheek, the sweat. It's hot. There's the knot of the dress being untied again, and she's given way. So clearly, she has had the pleasure of her lover. Sappho and the Sanskrit women poets offer us finely wrought explorations of desire in verse. That their poems have survived to the present day is a remarkable testament to the high regard in which their poems were held in cultures that were largely governed and administered by men. Considered together, the poems explore the ways in which desire is embodied, that is to say, experienced through the body and the senses. These Greek and Sanskrit poems are about seeing, laughing, touching, smelling, speaking, and feeling. They both represent the body and present perspectives on the body in love, the body that consummates and separates, that knows elation and pleasure, that indulges in hope and fantasy, and that recalls loss and privation. This attention to the body is complemented by poetic evocations of nature and the natural world. In Greek and in Sanskrit, the poets drape their verses in images, allusions, metaphors, and a whole range of rhetorical figures drawn from nature. The senses are regularly deployed to put affect and emotion in relation to nature. Barbara Stoler Miller, who is responsible for so many beautiful translations from the Sanskrit, points out that the classical poetic ideal is to compress the profusion of nature's qualities into a palpable, thick, emotion-laden atmosphere, so highly controlled that the audience participates in the aesthetic experience. The poems give audiences a chance to appreciate the human location of desire, and they do so in a language that is traditional, highly stylized, and distinctly individual. The poets show an exceptional degree of care with the language of love and desire, and among other things, these poets are seeking to comprehend the relationship between language and desire. An old and familiar problem, of course. Some commentators say that every literary text is in some ways about desire. Not least because stories, characters, plots, and formal devices frequently leave the reader craving for more. Sappho and Vidya present that situation writ large through their choices of subject and language. The manner in which the poems have been transmitted to us is tied up with the very theme. We see a fragment of verse and are eager to understand its fuller shape, to restore and recuperate lost words and forgotten contexts. The preservation of the poems in anthologies displaces them from their originary frames of performance, even as it locates them in a new genre. But the frame of the anthology makes you wonder about particular moments long ago when the poems were first recited or composed. To move in another, if related, direction, Freud made the point some 100 years earlier that love is mobile and malleable and nostalgic and at a deep level impossible to satisfy. The poems afford us a glimpse of that sensibility, and they also suggest that language does not exhaust the possible expressions of desire, that desire can be known through the physical and the material and can be experienced through the senses and nature. The poems imply that we can have love without the language of poetry, and at the same time exemplify how absolutely impoverished such a world would be. With the Greek and Sanskrit poets, the old forms are used to flex the capabilities of the lyric voice and of the first person singular in order to explore the linguistic, the affective, and the phenomenological. One of the interesting features of the poetry is that the narrative voice inhabits multiple subject positions and that the identity of the I voice often remains a mystery. This is, if anything, even more true of the Sanskrit than the Greek poems, since it is in the Kavya tradition of Sanskrit lyric that we find presumably male poets presumably adopting a woman's voice and writing about female desire. There's a notion here about the fluidness and mobility of desire and gender, or at least about the literary representation of desire and gender, and it's a theme that both the Greek and the Sanskrit texts raise. For the moment, that is for this afternoon, let us end on the idea that reading love poetry in Greek and Sanskrit challenges us to think about desire and literature and raises difficult questions about what happens when we express our love. Thank you.